Welcome to everyone. Lovely to have you with us this morning. We are going to get going in the next minute or two. We're going to be talking about a very interesting topic today. I've got three really great guests that I'm sure are going to give you lots of insights on this incredible topic of transitioning and learning perhaps about yourself in this time. So we'll get going in the next minute or two, but welcome to our session today. Thank you for taking the time out to be with us. And today is all about transitions and transitioning to the next. And what we found, is that whether you're transitioning to learn new skills for your career as the world around us changes, whether you are learning new skills because you've transitioned or want to transition from corporate into business, or you want to transition as I have, you have to transition because you've moved countries and you just need some different thinking. A lot of transition is all about you and having an awareness of what you're good at, what you're not good at, where you want to take yourself, what doors could be opened in the future. And so it's great to have you on board today as we talk about this really interesting topic of transitioning. So welcome to Learning Edge's first webinar of 2024. We look forward to engaging with you. So if you do have any questions in the session, please feel free to drop them in the chat. And as you're connecting in, please drop in the chat if you're comfortable. Where are you from? Where are you based? And perhaps what your interest is in today's session so that we can get some engagement initially. But what we're going to do is kick off, and I'm sure there might be one or two people still joining us in a couple of minutes. But really, I'd like to first of all welcome all of you and welcome our three wonderful guest speakers. They were chosen very deliberately because they've got some very credible and interesting insights to be able to share with you this morning. So I'd like to welcome the guest speakers who are part of our panel for today, and we're going to be discussing a set of interesting questions to pose to them so they can share some of their insights with you. So first of all, a warm welcome to Jane Robertson. Jane is a researcher who is focused on transformational and action learning, which you're going to hear a little bit more about today. She's a facilitator both of individual and team learning and a creator and the creator of an immersive learning experience called Lessons from Art, which Jane, I'm sure, will share some insights with us later today. So thank you so much, Jane, for your time. Secondly, we have Meshah Adams with us. Meshah has spent many years in executive education, and we have worked together in past lives, as well as Jane, interestingly enough. And Meshah is all about learning design, integration, and a human behavior specialist. And she's going to share with us some thinking around what are some of the trends in learning. And then what I'd like to do is also introduce Hymie to you. Hymie, thank you so much for being here today. And the way I'd like to describe what Hymie does and his team and his business is human-focused assessments that help you better understand yourself and how to prepare for the future by understanding yourself and then saying, how do I take that forward? So we've got a set of questions that we thought would be useful to explore together today. And so we're going to kick off and ask our panel some key questions. And as I mentioned, if you've got any questions, please feel free to drop those in the chat for us. And we've very deliberately thought about what we needed to speak about today because in preparing for a transition, the one thing is to better prepare yourself. And the only person you do have ultimate control of is yourself. But many of us, I think, don't always understand what tools we have available to help us prepare both mindset, skills, and all those necessary requirements. So, Jane, I'd like to kick off perhaps and pose the first question to you and really ask you, what is learning?
Hello, Kery, and hello, everybody. Thank you so much. Almost before I answer the question, what is learning, I just want to go take a step back. And Kery did start off about the different types of transitions that we look at. So I almost want to look at why we need to look at learning. So we're finding ourselves in these new situations in a challenging environment, which means that we're actually operating on the edge of our competence. I love that word. I mean, it's just, if you think about sitting on that edge, and it's such a great term, which means then we have to constantly learn, grow, and adapt. I'm not a big fan of the word unlearning. I know it's the current popular word at the moment, but I think if you know something, you can't unknow it. So really, that's why I want to define learning going forward. So there's very little consensus on what actually learning entails and how it occurs. So a prominent view is that learning will take place when we have new knowledge, but not only just the knowledge, we actually have to interpret that into behavior and then repeat it. So if we look at learning from that perspective, and I love what Imarentia wrote in the chat, that she takes every opportunity to learn. So for me, I'm really passionate about learning and how people learn. My daughter always says that she wants to be the best possible version of herself. And that's what I like to bring into our sessions, is how can people be the best possible versions of themselves? And that's why I started looking at transformative learning. And what we mean by transformative learning is that there's a perspective change. So if we look at the definition of transformative learning, there needs to be in a number of contexts. In other words, it needs to be breadth as we look at it. We also need to have relative stability. In other words, that permanence of that learning. And depth, of course, in the impact of that change. So not every learning experience is transformative.
Absolutely.
So maybe
Thanks
Hymie,
for
if
that.
you want to add to that.
Well, again, it's, the work that we do in particular the Learn Smartly reports that are used to start a learning journey is really more about, creating self-awareness. Like any journey, there's got to be two dots on the map. Where am I now currently, and where do I want to go to? So self-awareness and understanding your starting point, I think, is always so important. And this is kind of where the Learn Smartly sort of comes in, and in a rather unique way, by combining the neuroscience with stuff like your emotional health, self-limiting beliefs, and your resilience, your ability to bounce back, and then mapping it to your personality really gives you some really great data. And especially, we've moved away from what was called the learning styles, which was largely discredited, and moved more along with the neuroscience and started to look at the 4 quadrants of the brain. And really, by understanding, we all generally, even if it's unconscious, understand what our strengths are. But in every learning opportunity, there are areas that we are not good in and that we don't really understand. And by having that brought into line of sight, so if I'm spending X amount of money on my learning, and I'm dominant in 2 of the 4 quadrants, and I'm really avoid the other 2, I'm almost squandering 50% of the money that I'm spending on learning. So having the key measurements and knowing where the starting point is on the map gives you data that's almost the future of learning, is the data that you can provide in these type of reports. And it's a modest but powerful report, the Learn Smartly, and it's quite interesting. Jane, I think does that answer? You want a bit more?
I think you've both made an excellent point, Jane. I think, first of all, why do we need to learn? And the why is quite important often. I think we sometimes forget that people perhaps just jump into learning or offered learning opportunities, and they don't always understand the why behind it and how that's going to help them. And Hymie, I love the point you made that, understanding where you're starting from is really important if you want to make a change and understand where you're going to. And often I think we don't always have insight into that. So using tools like the Learn Smartly assessment is great because it gives you some of that insight. And also I think, a lot of us, even as adult learners, don't always understand the best way to learn or how we learn in a way, as Jane, you mentioned, with the transformational experience and change our perspective. Because I think both are very important. It's not just learning for learning's sake. We actually want to enhance knowledge and be able to use it more effectively in what we do every day. And I think that gets us really to this whole concept of, for most of us, we're adults and we experience adult learning, but perhaps if we look at the evolution of adult learning, Jane and Meshah, you've been involved, I think, in adult learning for quite a significant amount of time. And maybe, Jane, to start with you, then to move to Meshah, is what have you seen in that evolution? And what are some of the things you're seeing as perhaps trends that are out there that we could also be aware of to harness for ourselves?
So when we look at adult learning, we must remind ourselves, first of all, that learning is cyclical. It's not a once-off event. So often when we look at, and Meshah can talk about this a little bit later in terms of program design, it's not something that we can just do to someone. So learning is not something that we can, in our programs, just make happen and do it, and now you've learned it. So we're dealing with adult learners, and that's why I love your question so much, Kery. So it means we need to give people the choice of what they want to learn. So not only what they want to learn in terms of content, but how they learn. So as facilitators, we need to make sure that our approach is learner-led, not facilitator-led, which sometimes can be a bit of a paradox, especially when we're dealing with organizations who have set competencies that they want to then work around those. So if we look at adult learning, it can actually be developmental, which is really about human effectiveness. But it can also be transformative, which then is emphasis on that self-understanding that Hymie was talking about. Meshah, do you want to add to that?
Absolutely, Kery. Thank you so much. So what we found in the evolution of adult learning is that exactly what Dr. Jane referred to is that it's very data-driven. Which also touches on Hymie's point about understanding your preferences, your personal styles of learning, your different modalities that you use in your brain, and the neurological pathways that allow for the shifts in thinking that again refer to Dr. Jane's example of learning being demonstrated in a change in or a shift in behavior, and that being implemented holistically. So just to speak about data-driven learning is a form of learning that is understanding where you are starting from. So Hymie's points about knowing exactly where you are right now and where you want to go and how to get to that place is informed by that data-driven learning component. So that's a massive evolution and trend that we found in the industry at the moment. Demand-led learning, people want to learn what they want to learn. They don't want to waste their time on learning about finance if they don't want to learn about finance, or learning about marketing. If they don't want to learn about marketing, they want to learn what they want to learn. So we're shifting more towards these curated and customized learning designs for specific individuals that suit their succession pathway and their transition pathway that they are experiencing at the moment. Another trend that we've identified is this integration of emotional, behavioral, and neurological learning. Again, mentioned a little bit before, but in being a learning integrator, what becomes very important is to make sure that there is this consistent balance between the theory that the delegates receive, the shifts in behavior that we want demonstrated, the emotional intelligence that we want improved, and then ultimately the neurological pathway that we want to embed to sustain that learning. The other evolution that we identified is that diversity of thinking, goals, environments, and internal paradigms play a huge role. And I think that ultimately goes back to Hymie's point of self-awareness. Who are you, where you come from, what are your preferences? And finally, the difference between competence and compliance. So yes, I've got my driver's license, I am compliant, but can I actually drive? Am I competent in my ability to drive a motor vehicle at the age of 18, a year after I've gotten my driver's license? So there's definitely that which is being focused on more, not the actual theoretical transfer of knowledge, but the application of that knowledge.
Meshah, thanks so much for that. And it's great to, I think, be aware of these trends and also see how, I guess, the concept of adult learning is evolving over time as, you know, there's a different lot of generations coming to the fore, and also there are different tools we can use to learn in learning. But maybe a question to add on to that, and Hymie, I'd love to get your insights on this, perhaps followed by Meshah, is in knowing how I learn and what works best for me, how is that useful to me And then if so, how do I establish my learning preferences and non-preferences? And Hymie, I'm sure you've got some interesting insights from a lot of the assessments, but also from the in-year world. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on this one.
Well, again, as I said, sort of knowing how I learn and knowing that enables you to focus, but it's more important to know what your blind spots are, because knowing how I learn it's important, and we kind of know that. But it's kind of, how do I know what I don't know? So again, if we can sort of bring into line of sight areas that I'm missing, and I can work on that, I can really increase my ROE or ROI on my learning. Again, when you look at the tools today, and you touched on that, Meshah, as well, is that how does my emotional health impact my learning? Because if my sense of self-worth is really shattered, how's that going to impact? So the personal mastery, the emotional health really plays into it. Not only that, but my resilience. What is my ability to sustain, the learning? And then, of course, personality, introversion, extroversion, my ideal learning environments, where do I learn best? So when you look at the way we've taken this convergence of theories and provided the data for students to look at, this really, really enables us to learn, to become intelligent learners. And, in the world today, with AI coming in, people are becoming lazy learners. Give it to these guys. Let them, and actually, never before has it been more important to remain relevant as a learner, because we mustn't forget, we drive the AI thing, we do the inventions. So we mustn't lose that humanness and give away our ability to learn. So I think we're in a space today that is quite unique. We know what we don't know. It's kind of, to use an old phrase, we in this kind of VUCA world, and it's this dealing with ambiguity, but the more I know about myself, the more I know what my blind spots are, the more I can focus on those blind spots, the better I can become, more I can deal, more versatile, more comfortable I become with ambiguity, because I understand myself, my emotional health, my resilience is good, and so what we provide is not only the learning preferences of what I'm missing and what I'm not, but how do I build myself as a human being so that I can absorb and retain the learning?
I think that's so important, the point you made. And knowing those blind spots is key. And I think, Meshah, to add to that, you've got some interesting perspectives to share on the generations and perhaps how they learn also, and taking into account, because for some of us, some of that might even be a bit of a blind spot in terms of, sort of generalizations we make about, oh, this generation, they do X. So from what you've seen on the generations, what are their preferences and non-preferences, and how do we take that into account, both perhaps in designing learning, planning learning, but also delivering learning?
Thanks, Kery. I think as an individual, when we're going through a transition, what's very important is that you need to remember that you are not going through that transition alone. You do not operate in isolation. You operate in an ecosystem, whether that be your family, whether that be your friends, whether that be the relationships that you've built over the last 15 years. All right. So when you are transitioning, you need to consider the different generations and how to include them. And like Hymie said, contribute to your resilience and your support system when you are shifting through certain transitions. So obviously different generational groups have different learning styles, which I'm going to speak to in a little while. But what's also very important to remember is that cross-cultural groups and purpose-driven groups also have specific styles of learning, which you need to adapt to. They want to know what they want to know. So to start off with, I'm going to speak about the baby boomers. All right, so that is your 1994 to, your 1946 to your 1964. who prefer traditional methods, right? Like instructor-led training, textbooks, face-to-face interactions. They love structured learning. So if you walk into a classroom of baby boomers and you have this agile, flexible, participant-led approach to teaching that Doc was talking about, it's not going to work for this generation because they're looking at you as the specialist. They're looking at you to walk into that room and own that space and teach them what they don't know. Again, they are motivated by opportunities to become mentors to younger people. Our Generation X, ladies and gents, which is 1965 to our 1980s, tend to appreciate more of a balance between your traditional approaches and your technology-enabled learning methods. So Hymie also spoke a little bit to AI, so that would be introduced very slightly at this level. They're still very uncertain about it. They like flexibility and autonomy in learning and prefer self-paced and independent study opportunities. So this generation, we have a word for them. We call them not imposter syndrome, but what's the word I'm looking for? Insecure high performers. All right, so your insecure high performers are going to sit in this category of individual, your Generation X. There's a lot of confidence building in terms of the internal paradigms that you need to do, a lot of shifts in the neurological pathways of learning. Then we have our millennials, who are often mistaken as also Generation Zs, but our millennials are born between 1981 and 1996. They absolutely embrace technology, digital resources, online courses, mobile apps, social media, micro-learnings, you name it technology-wise, they are all in for it. They want instant feedback. So these are delegates that look for instant gratification. They want it all framed positively. They want it all diplomatic, and they just want to know how absolutely wonderful they are and how they've already known about their blind spots, but they just did not or might not have been consciously aware of their blind spots that Hymie was talking about. This group of millennials actually seek opportunities for skills development and career progression. So they are actively looking for learning opportunities. Our Generation Zs are born between 1997 and 2012, and they are our digital natives. So highly apt, even more than I think we could ever possibly be, to the digital platforms. They love videos, infographics, integrated simulations, virtual realities, this world of online life that they have with avatars is an entirely new approach to teaching that sort of mindset, and they thrive in dynamic and experiential learning environments. So more immersions, more putting them into certain scenarios that they could possibly be in, and navigating in a psychologically safe environment, the complexities involved in that scenarios. However, ladies and gents, what I wanted to bring to your attention is that what we've got coming is our alpha generation. Our alpha generation is our kids at the moment that we refer to. So they are your 2012 to your current state, and they are going to be entering into the workplace when we are the little baby boomers that we refer to at the moment, right? So it's going to be this complete flip, but we still need to understand how to teach them, how to integrate them into the world of what we do. And this generation is all about interactive and visual mostly. You do get some auditory, but mostly is visual learning. Short attention spans, extremely short attention spans. They're used to the flick, right? Even my 3-year-old knows the flick of the thumb. So he's scrolling. They want personalized learning experience, collaborative social learning experiences, especially because of the shift that we're also finding towards homeschooling in our environment, and hands-on learning. So if we keep that in mind with these different generations as a basis, I think that would provide us with enough to at least build a platform to launch our learning or our transitions from.
I think Michelle make a very good point. I think the challenge is just in practically, we often have all these people in the same room, or we
Yes.
could potentially have these multi-generations sitting in one, environment, attending one training course. And I think it's about, keeping that in mind and saying how you design aspects in that help speak to some of those preferences, but also know it's not going to work for every single person in the room. But I think that's the challenge often, I think, as facilitators, that we need to think through and plan out. But also understanding that, I think having that awareness can just help make an effective learning experience. And leading a team of people, where you perhaps are doing even on the job kind of training and mentoring, can actually also, it's just something to be aware of. And all of us often work in teams where we do have these multi-generational workforces today, and thinking about what works for one person doesn't work for everyone. And I think that's something to bear in mind. But maybe that leads us to a very interesting question, and that is, how do we move, or what is required perhaps to move beyond traditional structures to reimagine learning for this new world we are living in? Like Misha, you already mentioned, there's a lot of technology today. Hymie, you've mentioned tools. Jane, you mentioned, transformative experiences. We've spoken about things like immersion. So maybe, Misha, if I could ask you some perspective on that, and then Jane and Hymie also to get you insights after Misha has shared. What do you think is needed, Misha, to move, and create a learning world, I guess, fit for the future?
Absolutely. So the starting point is definitely Hymie's role, which is how you learn, understanding who you are, what your strengths are, what your blind spots are, your approach to different learning methods. The next is how to embed and be innovative about the delivery approach that you select, which is of course Dr. Jane's role. Structuring your learning journey correctly to allow you to think differently and behave differently falls into my role. All right, so that is why you've got your three panelists at the moment. There are ultimately three main delivery approaches that people can use to transfer knowledge when they are transitioning, and that is face-to-face learning methodologies, which we are all comfortable and know about. The second one is remote synchronous learning, which is the environment that we are in at the moment. It's a remote session, but we are engaging. And then the third approach to learning or transitioning or helping yourself transition is online asynchronous learning, which is completely disengaged. You are on the system on your own, and it's individual learning that you undertake in your own time and space. Reimagining learning can be extremely, extremely tough, especially because, like Hymie said, there's AI, there's so many tools that are out there at the moment. I'm not going to speak about the one immersion that I know my colleague will mention a little later, but what's very important, as we mentioned earlier, is the neurological impact on the shifts in competency and the embedding of learnings, the shifts in thinking, and the changes in behaviors. Ultimately, that is our outcome of learning. That is what we want to see at the end of learning. How we get to that outcome, we can be innovative with, right? So we can use different techniques, different tools. People have tried learning through animals, learning through learning, micro learning, mobile learning, adaptive learning, customized learning, gamification, collaborative versus individual. And it's just, I can go on and on and on and on. It's just such an area of passion of mine. But ultimately, the question or the phrase that you mentioned, Kery, is how does transitioning fit into all these areas? And how do you assist people with transitioning when you have a group of 40 people in front of you that are all different generations, have different learning preferences, and have different learning styles? Now, on a coaching level, when it's one-on-one, it's easy. But when you are in this environment that you need to pull everyone together in, what's very important, and this is why I want to lead on to Dr. Jane, is the practical approaches and considerations that you need to take when entering into a space of reimagining how to achieve the outcome of neurological, behavioral, and competency shifts. Dr. Jane, over to you.
Thanks, Meshah. Meshah was talking about the different generations. And if we look at the different generations now, our leaders are now Generation X's. So in our top businesses, our leaders are really starting to be Generation X's. So we're seeing them a lot in our sessions. However, it doesn't mean we don't have other generations as well. So exactly to your point, how do we design and incorporate something that might be quite nervy? Like, for example, you've got an immersion, and maybe your Generation Z would love that. And maybe your Generation X, what did you call us, Meshah? The insecure high performer. That's me. And so how do we integrate all of that to create a beautiful learning experience for everybody in the room? And also keeping in mind that nowadays, if we look at the older generations, they would have one career, whereas if you look at the younger generations, they are going to be having multiple careers. So how do we prepare our people in the room, our participants, for these multiple careers? Because I always say to somebody who's in my class, are we employable or employed? And I think that's what we're trying to do, is we're trying to make people employable, or helping them to be employable. And that leads into that point about the multiple careers. So for me personally, what I'm loving in my work this year is the micro learning. So how do we have small chunks of learning? So instead of having this full day workshop that is content heavy, we have small digestible chunks. This prevents overloading. So I'm working on a course at the moment. We call it Think, where we use action learning, and I can talk to you a little bit later about that. But and that would be an example of these digestible chunks of learning. Also, if we are looking at self-paced learning, that would also be a digestible chunk of learning, where you look at something when it suits you and you learn it in your own time, and then when you go back, it's also chunked up learning. In terms of our bigger programs, the Meshah was referring to is our immersive learning, and that's when we engage learners in the environment. So it's in real time, and at the moment I've designed a beautiful workshop called What Can Leaders Learn from Art? And there's just so many, how can we think differently if we're not in a different environment? So we're using art to stimulate thinking, and we'll be present in a gallery. And this it gives you the ability to think in a human-centered space. And I absolutely love art. I know very little about art itself. So I am not, someone said to me the other day, do you know how to draw? I said, no, it's not about that. So it's about being in a beautiful gallery. And if you look at art, art can tell us a story that words can't necessarily always articulate for us, because it communicates those emotions, our experiences, those messages, and it can touch people at that deep level. So when we're in that immersive experience, it gives us the opportunity to connect those unseemingly unrelated ideas and connect them and put them together, and then get a new perspective or a fresh perspective on that.
Thanks, Jane. Hymie, your thoughts on how to prepare for that sort of next journey in learning?
Well, again, so, just coming back a little bit to talk about when you've got all these different generations as a facilitator, how do you deal with that? And it's almost the question there would be, how do you create a values alignment that sort of gets the team? How do we, almost that little initial exercise with the group, how do you find common ground? Let's agree to a behavioral sort of framework. It's quite a useful thing, I think, for facilitators to bring that group cohesion across the different generations. But the other thing I want to point you to is the way we present curriculum. If you look at McCarthy's research in the format model, and she was one of the forerunners and this is looking as educators in terms of how we present curriculum. So if you look at the research and you look at the results across Australia and North America that she's had with the format model, and and you look in the Learn Smartly Educator report, we actually steer educators into that, because what is my teaching styles? What is my natural teaching style as an educator? So format talks to, if you present your curriculum sequentially in a way that engages all four quadrants of the learner's brain, the chances are you'll have a much better impact. So starting off with why, the feeling. Why are we doing this? What's it about? What's the meaning in the education? Moving into the thinking. What is the rationale? What is the thinking around it? Then move into the structural side. Let's get the stuff done. And then intuition. How do we improve? And educators are having really big impacts. And I know in the corporate world, corporates like Capitec are using the format approach in designing their learning journey. So that is also something that I think can quite significantly contribute to, crossing those generational barriers, but also making and engaging and getting better outcomes as educators. So yeah, that's my little bit.
Thanks, Hymie. And I love the fact you spoke about the fact, for example, Learn Smartly gives you an educator report, which I think is very powerful. As a facilitator, you don't always have the insight as to who's in your class and what are their preferences, and also understanding how that fits with your own. So having both perspectives would be very useful, I think, to also help us design things more effectively, to engage those quadrants and actually get something working where, irrespective of which generation you're from, the outcomes and that value-based sort of alignment is set almost from the beginning, which could be really useful to help people engage more and I guess also take that knowledge and really turn it into applied learning as they take it into business and into their personal lives, because it's not always just about applying it in the business you work in. Hopefully, learning goes beyond that and transforms you as an individual. But maybe that brings us to the next question, which is this whole, I guess, Jane, you started off with the thing of transformational, but also action learning. And we also been speaking about applied learning. And I know you've done a lot of study and did your research into action learning and what are the useful tools around it. So perhaps you can just share with us a little bit of what your observations are of that and what you've seen work well, even taking your immersion, and how do people learn by actually engaging things that are perhaps, I'm sure for most of us, art is not something we do every day or go and look at every day. So I'm sure it is a very different environment for people to find themselves in.
Kery, there's so many different learning approaches that we can bring into our learning programs. So I don't think there's one best approach. So when we look at it, I'm not advocating only for action learning or only for experiential types of learning. There's so many different types. And I think there's, and that's why the design of our programs is so important, which is Meshah's space. So if we've got the design right, and then we go in and we use a tool like your Learn Smartly tool that Hymie was talking about, that would be your start of it. Then once we've got that, then we can go and look at the approach. So there are a variety of approaches. Meshah mentioned coaching. There's lots of different methodologies, philosophies. But just to talk about two of them, it's specifically action learning and experiential learning, just to clarify what they are. So action learning is often confused with experiential learning. And I think it's because of that word action. But it's not. Okay, so that's the first thing. And it's if we look at action learning, it is the study of a real life problem. So if you look at a problem or opportunity in business, also takes place in real time. So it's not a case study, it's not a workshop, it's very specifically driven by a small group of people. So if we look at experiential learning, what the difference between the two is, experiential learning is really the creation of knowledge through that experience. So the art immersion that I was talking about, that would be experiential learning. Whereas if we look at action learning, it has about 4 key consistent elements. So the first one is it's a small group of people. So you would never have a big class like we would in a workshop of 30 people. You would have a small group of 4 to 6 people. And we call that a set, just another word for a group. It also looks, like I said to you, a real business problem. So an actual business problem. And it's a problem that's relevant to that group in their environment. Then what happens is that group meets and they engage with that problem. And the skills that we would use to engage in that problem is twofold. One is reflection. And for the panel knows me well, it's one of my favorite topics, reflection. I build it into everything because we need to slow down our thinking. Daniel Kahneman talks a lot about slowing down our thinking and not making quick decisions. So it's about slowing down our thinking, not automatically jumping to solutions. We're talking about dealing with I started today saying we live in a complex environment. So in order to understand that complexity, we need to slow down our thinking. And if we use reflection and we slow down our thinking, that is the first skill that we apply in action learning. But the second is asking really good questions. So if we look at it, action learning, it's such a great tool to solve those really challenging, meaty, we call it wicked problems. I also love the word knotty. It's a knotty problem. So it's not something that it's just a management problem that you know the solution and you would follow your process. It's that knotty problem. But why organizations love action learning is because it's quick. So it fits into that chunk of learning that I was talking about. So it's a quick methodology. It can develop people at the same time. It is also fits in terms of the adult learning principles because it's not facilitator-led, it's group-led. They choose their own learning. But most important for organizations, it's cheap. So it is a minimal cost to organizations to run action learning.
And Jane, I think if you think of action learning, I think it can really help people not even just necessarily on traditional programs, right? It's something as a tool that we could use in business and say, let's put a little task team together that's going to deal with this problem. And I think the trend you're seeing in business today, which is interesting, is a lot of businesses who are in perhaps more traditional sort of areas like banking and things like that, when setting up or trying to compete with the fintechs, are almost creating those little project teams to go and say, go and set up the new bank and go and run it and go and solve these problems. And I guess that's action learning to its truest core in business, is go and solve a real problem right now and do it in the shortest space of time. But I think there's some very valuable insights you mentioned there, which is stopping to pause and actually ask the question of, are we seeing the real problem, or we're just kind of putting the Band-Aid on and hoping that this little fix works. And I think it comes down to that sort of design thinking mentality around finding root causes and really then thinking differently about solutions and using tools like innovation and creativity. Meshah, from your perspective and looking at that, anything to add?
Absolutely, Kery. Very often a common trend is the word problem dissolving and not problem solving anymore. And I think that speaks so strongly to what Dr. Jane mentioned about identifying your wicked problem and tackling this knotty problem. I'm going to steal your words, Doc. And tackling these knotty problems where they actually lie in real time. Now, when you don't have the ability or the funds, how do you actually go about identifying your problems, because you're basically thrown into the deep end? So let's use an organizational transition as an example to a different managerial level, a different department, a different role, or a different environment, a different location. When you are in these actual real life situations where you have to make decisions in real time, identify real issues that exist in that current moment, the things that could often help you are your 360s, your 360 tools, getting feedback from everybody. Remember what I said before, you're an individual, but you do not operate in isolation. Get feedback from those in your team, get feedback from those in your families, from your entire ecosystem, and compile that to identify your blind spots so you know where to start when you are in a situation where you have been thrown in the deep end and you are doing something wrong, but you don't know what you are doing wrong and you need to fix it. Another one is a stop, start, continue model, which lies with Dr. Jane's reflection, just pausing and thinking about how you think, thinking about, your approach to thinking, your approach to responding, your approach to reflecting, your approach to introspecting, just taking a minute to pause and actually internalize and reflect on all of those things. Another element that we can use when we are thrown in the deep end in situations like this, because as Adams Solutions, I do have a consulting branch, which is what we refer to, or what we encourage companies to do with peer-to-peer learning and networking. So very often, and we find this in big corporations that operate in silos, it's still very, very common. The one department doesn't know what the other department does, and then they automatically find themselves falling into this drama triangle of defensiveness, blame, and victim mentality. All right, so what we do to adjust that is we create a systemic perspective, this principle of systems thinking and this principle of viewing the organization as a whole and actually breaking down silos so that we break free of that drama triangle and actually get to a place of productivity when we are going through transitions, because very often what we find is we get stuck. And to get unstuck, this is where you need to start. Thank you, Kery.
Thanks, Misha, and thanks, Jane, for that. I think very valuable tools, and I would agree with you on reflection. I think things like journaling, just personally, make a huge difference to sort out your thoughts, and also creating that space to think things through and not make rush judgments. Often the world is a very busy place, and we can forget to take time out to stop and think about things that we need to experience. So, I guess to wrap it up, Misha, would you like to slide now or before we get to
Yes,
the last
please.
question? Let me just share. Misha's got some great thoughts to share with you, and I'm just going to put that on screen.
Thank you.
Right. So, our last sort of question we're going to come to, and Misha, you're going to share with us first, and then I'd love to get both Jane and Hymie's thoughts in closing, is we've discussed a lot today about how the world is changing, how things are shifting, what's required of educators, learning designers, and education professionals, but also for us as students and learners. And I guess this is something to just close on and think of as the world is changing and moving forward. How do we equip ourselves better? How do we know how we learn, what our preferences are? But then how do we, in business, if we're thinking about training our teams in future, what do we need to be doing? And so, Misha, please share with us some of your thoughts on what do we need to do perhaps from the educator space and designing of learning experiences, and then we'll get some insights from Jane and Hymie to round off our discussion this morning.
Absolutely, Kery. Thank you. So Dr. Jane and Hymie and I have shared a host of information with you. What this diagram illustrates is a combination of all of the components that you need to consider in order to successfully transition from point A to point B. Whether it is in your career, whether it's transitioning to becoming a father, whether it is transitioning to becoming or to a new location, regardless of the transition you are encountering, these are the three components that you need to think about. So this is a summary of all of the discussion points that we mentioned to allow you to have a framework to work towards when you are thinking of going through a transition or actually going through a transition in itself. So to start off with, we start off with the middle component, which is your individual. What you need to consider is that you are not transitioning alone. You are transitioning with your family members. If you do not have a family, then you are transitioning with the relationships that you have developed over your years of networking, your relationship with your colleagues, your relationship with friends, and we call these people stakeholders, right? But I think relationships is more of a personal word. You need to accurately define your personal objectives. All right, that's the next point. You need to actively define your personal objectives. And that speaks so closely to Dr. Jane's emphasis on reflection and introspection and changing the narratives in your mind. And how do you begin? With Hymie's level of self-awareness. All right, you understand who you are and you define who you want to be. Ladies and gents, we've got a very interesting word in the little purple circle that's illustrated on the screen. It is an environment. So if you look at the word environment only, it refers to and is defined as a multitude of promises, pitfalls, benefits, and risks. It's like a grand challenge that you are experiencing. So what is it? So your in is your you. All right. So what is this environment, this transition within yourself that you are moving into, and how do you navigate that? What you need to think of first is what you want versus what you do not want. All right. What you want versus what you do not want, because both are equally as important. We speak about the learning options available to you in order to assist you with your transitioning. So whether it is a move to China and you need to learn a different language, whether it is a move in management and you need to learn a different level of thinking from operational to functional to strategic, whether it is a change in becoming a mother or a parent or adopting. All right, we need to understand the learning tools available to us. We need to understand, as Hymie mentioned earlier, that this environment is going to be extremely ambiguous, and we need to find comfort in that ambiguity. So what do we do then? We go to our coaches and we go to our mentors to assist us in dealing with our anxiety that we face when it comes to this ambiguous environment. We look at what Kery mentioned right in her introduction. What do you have control over and what do you not have control over? And we classify those and we practice techniques to allow you to release what you have no control over versus what you do have control over. And ultimately, ladies and gents, your number one reason is, why are you transitioning? All right. Now, obviously, when you transition, if we move over to the little green circle, the area that you are transitioning into needs to be defined. What are you transitioning into? Are you relocating? Are you moving for a better job option or job possibility for your family? Are you moving locations? Are you running away from your family? All of those three things define you leaving your current location, but there are different reasons. All right. So what is the space that you are transitioning into and why you are transitioning into that space? You need to understand your opportunities that are aligned to your strengths that you already have from Hymie's assessments, which is going to identify your strengths and your limitations, which is the next option. You need to look at optimizing your low-hanging fruit. And ladies and gents, this sits with your relationships. It sits with your relationships, it sits with your research, it sits with understanding what you do not know, right? And then finally, you look at shifts and trends in that area. Now, Hymie mentioned, I think even Kery mentioned, what do you do when you don't know what to do? And when you are transitioning, the key to making a successful transition is understanding exactly what to do when you do not know what to do. And Hymie also spoke very closely about a concept called AI. Now, I'm going to speak about a concept called AI that I love, that takes you out of the space of unknown and into a space of known. And that is called appreciative inquiry. Appreciative inquiry involves asking different types of questions in different types of ways to give you different types of answers. And all of these tools that you learn in this 3I ecosystem that we've created for you will allow you to structure your questions differently. I'll give you some examples of appreciative inquiry. If you are working on a project in the office and it fails drastically, what is your first response? What went wrong? Who was responsible? Where did it go wrong? Why did it go wrong? Where did it fall? What happened? We had a project plan. What went wrong? Instead of asking, but wait a second, what went right? And that is appreciative inquiry. So appreciative inquiry is focusing rather on a different component of your question. And Dr. Jane will speak to this as well with the importance of reflection and introspection to allow you to move you to a space of knowing what to do when you do not know what to do. So you at least have that starting point. Dr. Jane, Hymie, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Meshah. I love your point on appreciative inquiry. I think the use of really good questions, people struggle with that because they're so used to being rewarded for action. So if you have a situation and then going straight into action and straight into solution, so even just asking really good questions is a challenge. So my parting thoughts on this is really, if we go back to this model, Meshah talked about the environment. So for me, if you look at it, the first thing when any transition, ask yourself, what am I feeling? Because you might be feeling overwhelmed, or you might be feeling very excited. You might be feeling both. So first of all, identify how you're feeling, because neuroscience tells us if we label the feeling, it helps us to deal with it. So that is my last little skill that I'd like to add. Hymie, over to you.
Yeah, I must be honest with you. I think the thing that really stands out for me is this slowing down. And actually, I often say to leaders, you need to slow down to speed up, because your natural instinct is just to get into action, get the thing done. And you see it especially with leaders that are too operational, and they get people running to them the whole time, and they just want to climb into action, and they end up solving the wrong problem. So for me, a really powerful model in this space is, if you look at the time and you look at the way you go about things, slowing down says, the first thing I've got to do is I've got to have a conversation for understanding. Let's understand what it is that I'm trying to solve. Then that's almost 60% of your time that you spend. The other conversation is conversation for possibilities. So what could I do to resolve it? And action is really the last 10%. So this concept of slowing down to speed up is so powerful, and it goes even further, because it says, as a leader, am I giving them fish, or am I teaching them to fish? Because if I'm just jumping into action and solving, or not even solving necessary, but dealing with the wrong issue, just that whole approach, turning the sort of pyramid upside down, so powerful in going forward. And just another reflection, might be a little one, would be in terms of action learning. And I know we have a number of different businesses, but the 5 Lens Enneagram business, which is built for coaching and team effectiveness, our team processes are very much action, taking a small team. And, the science of team effectiveness tells us that team is 7 ± 2. So it talks to that very small number of people. And actually, introducing a skill and getting them to actually engage in real-time use of that skill, whether it be, and again, when one looks at, we talk often, we want to get breaking down of silos and collaboration. But in order to collaborate, teams and groups need to have a powerful and practical way of dealing with conflict. Giving and receiving feedback is even more important. Then they need to know how to, that builds trust. And only when you have those ingredients can you really, truly collaborate and start to break down silos. So just that's a little tidbit on kind of the work we do also in that action space. Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks. And thanks so much for sharing those great thoughts. I think for myself, it's just having you on board this morning, ready to stop and think about how we put learning experiences together, and also to better understand ourselves, what is best for us as we learn, and to pick the learning experiences that are actually going to add value and not just learn for the sake of learning, so that we can get to that phase of real transformative learning. And in doing that, hopefully we do stop, we think, we ask better questions, and we engage, and therefore can take that and really apply it in our workplace and engage with others, so that they see, I guess, a difference when you have moved in your potential and have some better answers because of all of that. So I would just like to say a huge thank you to Meshah, Jane, and Hymie for their time this morning, for sharing their insights. If anyone online would like to get hold of them, here are their email addresses. And if you are interested in doing the Learn Smartly assessment, there is a link. You can go to our Learning Edge website and undertake the assessment. Hymie has kindly offered as a prize this morning, for 2 special people. We'll do an online draw, and you'll be getting a free link to go and do that assessment. And hopefully it just provides meaning to you in understanding why it's so important to know where you're starting from. So I'd just like to thank my 3 guests. Thank you for your insights, for sharing your wisdom of what your experience has shown. And hopefully for those of you listening today, you've got some value about thinking about for yourself on your learning journeys and what learning you want to do in future. You've got some insights into what to do differently, what to do with your teams, your clients. And we thank you so much for your time. We have got a couple of minutes available still, so we would like to allow for any questions. If you do have any specific questions that you would like to put to any of our panelists, you can either type them in the chat, or please feel free to raise your hand, unmute yourself, and our colleague Belinda Wagner will help just to manage those questions as we move forward. But thank you very much for those of you joining us. I hope it added value to you, to give some thinking about learning and how we should learn differently. And hopefully you all learned something by being part of this today. I know I did. So I'm going to stop there and just ask and open the floor and see if there are any specific questions from our listeners and participants this morning?
None in the chat so far. If anyone else, oh, there's a hand. Jane, if you want to just ask the question, your hand's up. Thank you.
Thank you, Belinda. So I've been listening intently, and thank you so much for the insightful information. It was really good to listen to all of this. It's definitely going to help me in my future work. But I do have a question. When one looks at, apologies, let me put on my video, just so you're not talking to a voice. There we go. So when one looks at learning and looks at the process of learning and transitioning, we, as was mentioned earlier on, we do actually deal with a host of different people. And Dr. Hymie also mentioned that, we are also looking at the four quadrants of the brain and so on. The one thing that I think is something that we need to perhaps, or I would like more information on, is the question of resistance. Because sometimes people are not even aware that they are resisting a certain process in terms of learning. Perhaps the panel can share some ideas on resistance. Thank you.
Jane,
Janie,
perhaps
thanks.
can I
Let
ask
me,
you to field
yeah,
that one? I think you might be able to help or
let me
share
kick
some
this off.
observations.
So that was, Janie, that's going into my point about the adult education, that we can't force people into learning. So for me, it's upfront, especially from an organizational perspective, is that how do we onboard people into a learning program or into the process? So I think, and I'm going to ask Meshah to add to this, because it's so important that we get the design right. And there are so many stakeholders that are involved in a training process. So it's that upfront, that onboarding that is so important. And then, of course, when you're in the session itself, for the facilitator to create an environment where there is psychological safety, where you do have resistance. So I find if we get those 2 points correctly, if we focus enough on that, it reduces the amount of resistance. But you're always going to get 1 or 2 people who might not want to be in the session. And then I think they must have the choice not to be there. So I think timing of learning is so important. I know at various stages of my life, personally, if you'd sent me on a training program when I was traveling a lot, when I had very small children, my life stage just would have been very, very difficult. I've got at the moment, I've actually got on one of our programs, I've got somebody who's on a full year program with us and doing their masters. And I think that's a lot to take on. So they aren't resistance, but they have a lot on their plate. So it's also what sort of relationship do you form with the people in your class so that they can tell you when they're struggling. And that's why I think for me, learning, we must keep reminding ourselves it's not a once-off event. Mm-hmm. So it's the relationships that are so important.
Absolutely, Doc. And I'd also just really like to add that component of psychological safety, which is why we often start our programs with the fact that you are not perfect. I am not perfect. We are not perfect, but we are here to learn, and we are peers. We are allies. We are not enemies. This is a psychologically safe environment, and we start off that session with personal mastery, which is often a result of an assessment like Hymie's assessment. So in personal mastery, we dive into all of that, and it builds psychological safety, what Jane said, in the classroom. There's also different techniques that you can use to building trust with the people that are in your team. A lot of trust issues, for example, you might not even realize it, but the fear of delegation actually has an underlying root cause of a lack of trust in your team. The fear of having difficult conversations is a lack of trust in yourself in remaining emotionally intelligent in those situations. So this component of trust in organizations and in the world today is massive, it's huge. But often what we do when we are met with people who do not want to learn, and I'm going to send you some content on it, is that we move them from a fixed mindset to a growth mindset. And we explain that only when you are open psychologically and emotionally and behaviorally to the shifts that are needed in order to upskill you to get you to the next level. You are perfect where you are. You're wonderful where you are. You know, we all have those egos. You're amazing where you are. But to get you to that next level, this is what we are going to help you tweak. All right. So that shifting also from a fixed mindset to a growth mindset is very, very important to include in your personal mastery on day one. Hymie, anything to add?
You know, it's really interesting because, again, I just look at the work we often do in team effectiveness. And when you work with a team, the first thing to do is to contract them from a behavioral point of view. How do we need to be with one another to make this a safe space? And really, and just going back simply to like the Tuckman model of team effectiveness and how teams move from forming to storming to norming and performing. I know that Drexel University in the States uses a simplified version of that when they bring their cohorts together. So how are we going to work together to actually get the best results? And it's kind of that basic alignment around values. How do we need to be? And it's funny, you know, because, you know, in teams and groups, you know, conflict emerges. You know, people don't give and receive feedback. It's more criticism. So, you know, explaining basic principles of, you know, being open to receiving feedback, being able to giving it with an intention to help grow. And if you can embed those basic principles in the group early on, you can get buy-in and you can build the trust that, as I said, enables collaboration and stuff like that. So, you know, there's quite a few of these sort of things that you can do, and they're simple. They're actions. That you can do as a facilitator to really onboard people and to create that bubble, that safety bubble that is necessary to create learning environment that'll get. But you know, at the end of the day, you can take a horse to the water, you can't make a drink. If somebody doesn't want to, then they must leave. You know, you can't force people to do stuff they don't want to do.
And Hymie, I would only echo that, but I think also to Meshah's point, sometimes you know, that resistance actually might be a fear of like, especially for someone perhaps more senior, who perhaps didn't always get an opportunity to have the right education, especially in South Africa, to maybe be called out for not knowing something. And I think unless we can create the environment that it's okay to not, like Meshah, you said, we're not perfect. We don't know everything, but we're here to learn from each other, and we each bring, as an individual, something to the table. I think often that resistance is maybe, why am I here? Does my boss not think I'm good enough in my role that I've now been put on a learning program? You know, some people interpret that the wrong way, and it might actually be an inherent fear of being caught out and not knowing. And we just need to manage that, and I think encourage people and offer them the space to work through that sometimes. But I do agree, Hymie, if the person is very, you know, they're not going to change and they don't want to be here, having them in the group is actually worse for the group, because it will detract from the learning journey for everyone else. So it's a balancing act, I think, as a facilitator and learning integrator, to know when to try and get that person to push through the resistance, but also when to back off and go, this is not for you, and maybe we need to think about something else. Any other questions before we wrap up our session today?
No more in the chat. All good, I think.
Okay, thanks, Belinda. And I just want to say thank you, everyone. Jane, Meshah, and Hymie, thank you so much. It was lovely being in conversation with you today, and I'm sure we can all have some really good takeaways. And thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it. Have a wonderful day, everyone, and take care.
And thanks for facilitating, Kery and Belinda, and all of you for being with us today. So thank you very much, and have a wonderful weekend.
Yes, absolutely. Enjoy the rest of your Friday, everyone. Take care.
Bye.
Cheers for
Kery.
now.
Bye.
Thank you.
Okay.